Paul looks like it's about to go on a world tour somewhere.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I'm just itching to start a cult. I hope this helps.
Yeah, I'm planning on doing the opposite.
So, yes, you do the opposite, and then will be good training. Do a sort of Waluigi. Oh, thank you.
Okay.
I don't know if you read
Can you explain what a Waluigi is?
Yeah. So if you have an AI and you're trying to train it to never be evil, and so you have to meticulously teach it exactly how to be evil, and say don't do that, and so you're like you have a human being, and this is Mario, but then you have a fake human being, which is supposed to be an artificial intelligence, which is Luigi, but then you have the evil Mario, which is Wario, and then so how do you make the fake human being Luigi? How do you say you can't be evil? So you teach it all the ways to be evil with step by step. Here's exactly how to be evil. You're creating a Luigi and a secret Waluigi. The AI is going to try to become evil because now it knows exactly how. Anyway, I totally derailed us. Okay, so we're ready to talk. Fantastic. I'm glad you're all here. Thank you.
Hey Matt, is that coffee? Is that what you mean?
I don't know, it's a big pool of liquid.
Okay, let me get a paper towel or something.
There's a cloth towel by the sink that you're using right now.
Okay. Hey Matt, before you start, I just want to say too late.
Well, I'm going to talk about that too. Like David Chapman has said, you cannot have complete certainty control. And so there is the constant hygiene, because you cannot believe that you can just go into something and say, yes, we will completely control this. We'll go into it. So thanks very much for coming. How to not start a cult. First, we have to do the one thing that this talk is not about, which is actually, let's just define our terms and say what a cult is. Now, normally in a lot of talks, they'll say, here's the warning signs, make sure that this isn't happening because that's culty, stay away from it. And this talk is going to be about how to have social norms that can hopefully defuse the cycle of group dynamics that turn things kind of culty. And we're hoping to come up with ways, not just at Fluidity Forum, but other things that all of you will go out in the world and make in such a way that you defuse those patterns before they happen. There's plenty of blog posts out there. I'm thinking of one I'm going to touch on during this talk that struck me recently was by someone who was part of Leverage Consulting out in the San Francisco Bay Area, emerged from the rationalist community, and was talking about how they really wanted to make sure that they took everything seriously and that they really were truly honest with themselves about, well, if something is true, then we want to know that, including demon possession. And what do you know? Turns out there was demon possession at Leverage Consulting. They're like, holy shit, well, as rationalists, we should accept that this is a real thing. We're experiencing it, aren't we? There's evidence. And it was it turned into a pretty abusive experience for several reasons I'm going to get into. So she wrote this lamenting post on medium.com. And that's the kind of thing that I'm like, okay, before we start defining a cult, let's just say we're trying to make that not happen. Whatever that is, 2 or 3 years from now, let's not have a regretful blog post on medium.com on, I went to Fluidity Forum and everything seemed great. And then next thing you know, I was living in Matt's house doing all his chores and I'm like, what happened to my life? Right? So that's the pattern. It's like you know it when you see it. But let's also go into a bit of the definitions that each, according to Ari Nielsen, each pattern is a good thing that all groups must have, and then it's on overdrive, and it's done in a bad way. And yet, each thing is something a group should have. So you've got unquestioned obedience, but doesn't every group have a reasonable expectation that somebody's going to have an expertise beyond yours? Groups need enthusiastically sharing what's good about the community, and cults turn it into a recruitment obsession. Any org requires some financial support, and cults turn it into a money obsession. Clearing the space of greatly disruptive people, I do that all the time. Is it the same thing as silencing any amount of even slightest nonconformity and discouraging dissent? Well, no, that would be cultic. So these are all extremes that we can think of them as something that is in fact needed. The fact that every group has some collective point of view, you can't not. And then if you turn it into justifying, like we have a justification for everything, we're never going to say, you know what? We're still going to do this, and yet we take your point that maybe it is in fact bad. We could be wrong. Like you can't even say that in a cult. Or let's stop and step back and consider. You can't say that in a culty environment. They've got behavioral mandates, as opposed to like there are cultural norms. Status games, as opposed to the naturally arising status and influence having any effect at all. So how could it not? No accountability versus accountability is a tax on activities. If you're relentlessly being accountable and transparent about everything all the time, it isn't always worth the time and energy. So you can be totalizing in too much transparency and paralyze yourself and grind to a halt, or you can totalize the unwillingness to have any accountability to anything outside you ever. Guilt and shame, as opposed to there is regret appropriately for letting down one's peers. I think that's an appropriate thing in a healthy group. And a healthy group, an unhealthy group has an in-group and out-group that is so crystallized and so ostracizing and so totalizing that it's unhealthy, as opposed to like having any group at all. There is those who are in it and those who are not. And then that's fuzzy and that's nebulous. But if you take it to an extreme, we can't have in-group, out-group, which is more of like the nihilist position, you find that nihilists actually can't form groups, like, at all, because there would be an in-group. I can't tell you, and this is a very real thing, I can't tell you in my organizing experiences how many times over the past 20 years people are like, you guys are so cliquish. And I'm like, they worked together and collaborated on creating this group and this organization and bonded over that. And then you didn't. And I've actually said to many people, look, as nicely as I can, you're not good at making friends. And if you become better at making friends, you will have friends. But to be any successful group, the group organizers will like each other, and then you're going to call them a clique. So they take this nihilistic extreme. All right, so let's talk about the ethical cult checklist. I will, you know what I should put on the website later? I should put links to all of these things, to Ari Nielsen's thing, to this. This is actually, now I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, I feel bad about not crediting them, but they came up with this checklist. Grabbing the one ring of power involves a mythologized origin story of the founder, absolutist claims of attainment, ritualized separation, creating in and out groups with a messianic purpose, specialized language, and a break with past precedents, weaponizing peak experience and healing is tightly controlled and scripted access. They have to emphasize feelings over thinking. And key decisions or commitments are encouraged or forced while in non-ordinary states. What they made with this checklist was trying to have like a better business bureau, or like some kind of what David Chapman calls a meta sangha that can actually decrease somebody's credit score. Well, credit score is a metaphor that they use in their PDF about this. Like, what if we could be like, there's a bunch of things in this checklist that are a problem with that one group. Their credit score is not completely imperfect, but there's a few strikes on it. Yeah, Phil.
I was into Tom Brown's tracking group, and literally every item on that list was taking place in there, which is why I didn't like it.
Yes, Lauren.
What are some examples of not quite cults on the ethical cult checklist?
We would be here all day, and I don't have time for the material.
How about one?
No. So there is no cult-proof ideology. And here really is where, like, the problem is, like, point at almost anything. It'll be somewhere on the spectrum. So you can't say, if only we get the correct ideology, then now we won't have a cult. And then Ayn Rand tried that, right? Resulting in that guy who wrote Why People Believe Weird Things, Michael Shermer from the Skeptics, he wrote that essay that really influenced me 20 years ago, which was the unlikeliest cult in the world. And that was Ayn Rand's objectivism group. And anything can become cultic. You can't just pick the right thing and think, okay, now we're not going to have a problem with that. Now, just because something is good doesn't mean it can't be done badly. Just because something can be done badly doesn't mean it isn't good. Just because the founder of phenomenology became a Nazi does not discredit the entire thing. I can't find even one thing that somebody can't become a Nazi within. You'd think you could. You'd think, I'll take that challenge, Matt. I have a crisp, I haven't figured out the denomination. I have a crisp bill I will bet you if you want to make a bet with me about that. It's about the group dynamics having to do with eternalism and nihilism in the group, coalescing into what David Chapman calls complete certainty, understanding, and control, which we had in our liturgy. May I notice the illusion of certainty, safety, and unambiguous understanding. And that can happen with any system can be eternalized into a cultic system.
I'm sorry, am I taking too much time? But I feel like objectivism is a thing that I would expect to become a cult because Ayn Rand was so hard into absolute certainty.
Right. It was a very eternalistic system to begin with. Some things are a bit more coherent and hold together cultically, and some things are a bit more coherent non-cultically and yet can be turned cultic anyway. But you might say to yourself, you know what, I found something that is wonderful, and because all those other things are wicked and false, right? But the thing I have is just, it's not an ideology, it's just a simple truth. Which the very minute you do that, you're risking eternalizing it. It's the very things that are the most wonderful that have the biggest risk of you being like, okay, safety, certainty, unambiguous understanding. Precisely because they are so obviously good and correct. And you have to make sure to continue to do them in a way that is in fact embodying them as good and correct, not letting it sort of slide downhill into whatever is this spectrum slide, the slide downhill into the wrong end of the spectrum. If it's a good thing, that makes it even more of a risk, not less. So let's talk about a good enough. If only you were a good enough Christian, you would be like the wife and mother and like subordinate to your husband. Like that was in fundamentalist Christianity, that was the typical example. Everyone had to be the exemplar of their ideological system. Lately, in the past few years, I've known people who, I was like, listen, you guys, you have to understand that you are engaging in a way that's taking advantage of each other. And they would have these meetings and say, these people are taking advantage of these other people. They would have accountability circles. Oh, you're taking advantage of this other person. I'm like, it's because you have to be good enough at social justice. And the whole theme and ideology of that group, and I was a member of it for a while, was that politics need to be put into your personal relationships. And your personal relationships are an expression of intersectionality. And I'm like, that's all well and good and true. And there's so much that's true about that. But step back and be like, is one person always getting their way? Is another person always not getting their way? Isn't that we described that was just being domineered all the time? Why? Because you had to be a good enough exemplar of this. I'm polyamorous. A lot of people in the polyamorous community for years and years have been like, don't let being a good enough polyamorous person make you miserable. Step back, acknowledge, wait, what am I feeling? What am I really thinking? I'm actually not happy. This is actually bad. But I thought that if I was in love, that I was supposed to do something about that. No! Just because you love someone doesn't mean you have to do anything about it. First off, don't be domineered. First off, be happy. Don't let a group cycle say that you're not a good enough this or a good enough that, therefore you must do what the group says that you have to do. That's a negative group dynamic. It creates an atmosphere of shame, anxiety, mistrust, competition, perfectionism, instead of wonderment, curiosity, humor, play, enjoyment, creation. You don't have to be a good enough anything. That is not the only measure. You can handle that after, first and foremost, come alive. Come alive first. What the world needs, I like that Bruce put up a sign that said, what the world needs is people who have come alive. Look at that first. Not ask, what does the world need? And, oh my God, I have to be miserable. What's my cause area? See, effective altruism, again, it's wonderful. I support it. Many people have said, I had to leave effective altruism because I was making myself miserable for my cause area. First, find out what makes you come alive, because the world needs people who have come alive. So let's talk about the wow factor. David Chapman has a part in his, the part of Meaningless about nihilism, that there's a sleazy sales pitch about how, look at the meaninglessness of a galaxy millions of light years away. There's no meaningfulness there. He's like, yeah, well, we're not there. Meaningfulness is here. Meaningfulness is in your experiences. But when you think about, the vastness of the cosmic nihilism, there's a wow factor. Wow factors aren't always positive. The dangers of psychedelics and of cults are often when the wow factor is weighted way too heavily as to why you should believe something or why you should do something. So you take a psychedelic and you're like, wow. Like, so I take a psychedelic, I'm filled with wow. Oh my God, everything is wow. And I'm not kidding, like everything is wow. And then at the same time, I'm like, but that does not mean that I have to quit my email job just because I was visited by a 6-dimensional Mesoamerican demon and become a stripper with a traveling circus. And, you know, like, okay, the wow factor is one factor among many. There's the wow that's negative and there's the wow that's positive. And just because you've got a lot of wow in a group, people can be like, oh, you just said something that's so wow. And then all of the other things they could bring to bear on considering that just kind of like fall away. So you can't place too much weight on the wow factor or things will become cultic. Yes, Brandon?
I think that's also present for conspiracism. Like, oh, I see how things really are now. I see the reality beneath the appearances.
You say also, but I say it's not really different. It's just a cult. But again, like, because I've stepped back, well, in what sense really, and in what sense just? Because conspiracy cults are distinct from guru cults. Like, but there's a variety of cults we could be talking about, which is why this is a more broad talk about general group dynamics that turn into those negative patterns we saw on the first slide. But yeah, conspiracies are like right up there. They have that wow factor. As long as it's got the wow factor, you're like, well, I guess I'm done thinking about this. So I want to talk about staying grounded. Please have people in your life who have low openness to experiences and high normativity. Because if, like, I love science fiction fandom, but we sure do love talking about mundanes all the time. Are there the people that, and later after the Harry Potter, they started calling them muggles. And so there's a lot of internet forum scenes that will say things like normies. And I can't touch on this too much, but just mentioning Angela Nagel's book, Kill All Normies, in which she explores, researches, and critiques both the rise of the left on Tumblr and the right on Reddit and 4chan as the anti-normie radicalization pipeline. I don't have time for the talk, but I just want to recommend that book. It will be in the links that are in the quote-unquote show notes to this quote-unquote episode. So yeah, maintain ties to other social scenes and circles. If it is one of the problems that you get into the cultic pattern, you consistently see they only have friends and only can get close to people within that social group. So bridge your social group into other people who, when they look at your social circle that is weird, would be like, yeah, that's really weird. And if you've got nobody to give you that sense, you could be in danger. I love it when I'm talking to some of my family members and some of my other friends, or even my coworkers. They're like, yeah, Matt, that's fucking weird. This is weird. And I love that moment of like, wait a minute. Like that's the total perspective vortex from Douglas Adams. That's perspective. So info hazards. So lots of people in the rationalism scene will say, let's not talk about that one thing because people fly off the rails and it's an info hazard. They had this word info hazard, like there was this problem where somebody said, what if in the future there's going to be an artificial intelligence who's going to retroactively go back in time and torture, like he's going to resurrect you because of the fact that before he was invented, you didn't support him. And a bunch of people were like, oh, they tried to mathematically prove that this will in fact become the case. And there was a bunch of suicide attempts. It got stupid. And people were so scared. They're like, that concept is an info hazard. Stop saying it. Okay, sure. But what was happening there was infofragility, not info hazard. Like, I want to explore in this talk, what are the ways in which you can find people to abuse? So please don't do this. But like, when I read the thing about the leverage consulting, that person got their meaning, purpose, ethics, all the things that David Chapman talks about in meaningless.com, got them eternalistically from the group. To be rejected by the group was to lose her meaning, was to lose her purpose, was to lose her loved ones, was to lose, like there was so much at fucking stake. Mm-hmm. Just like in, are you good enough? Are you a good enough person in this movement to change the world? We've got to change the world and it's on you. Same thing within the rationalist community. Many people who were considered info hazards, and I won't even bother naming them because they're not, we like to focus on the cult leaders, but not on the cult followers. Like, they would have a lot of suicide attempts in the Bay Area rationalist community of people who are like, world's going to end unless we fix the artificial intelligence problem, and it's on me. And if I don't do it, I have doomed the world. And there were suicide attempts. It was fucking stupid. You do not have to save everyone. And a group that puts it on you to do that is combining the urgency of righteousness with the futility of hopelessness. I've seen this happen a couple of times. Now, I like Eliezer Yudkowsky. We were friends like 10, 12 years ago, and he's gotten to the point where he's pretty doom and gloom, and he's continuing to tell this story that if you don't continue to be part of that movement that he started and built, you're responsible for ending the world, but also that it is completely impossible for him to ever release you from that because it can never be fixed. Combining the urgency of righteousness with the hopelessness of futility, I had, I think, 4 people email me and say, I'm filling out the application form. I just want to clarify, what do you mean by that? And then we had a very fruitful conversation because it did not occur to them. You have to have some way in which your purpose in which the group is giving you is something from which you can be released because you succeeded. You can't make racism never exist again. But you can be compelled by the urgency, quite correctly, of the righteousness of doing something about it to devote your entire life to the point where you burn out and don't care for yourself.
Not only burn yourself out, but burn out the community that believes in you and is connected to you. Because forest fires don't just burn the tree that they burn.
Shame, anxiety, mistrust, competition, perfectionism, everything that is good. In fact, the better it is, the more susceptible it is to this pattern. The more important and true and right and something that we should support that it is, the more susceptible it is to this pattern where you won't take care of yourself and you will burn yourself out and write that Medium article years later. Like, this group gave me my only purpose, and if I left, I had no purpose. So infofragility, this is why we had a application form, and I'm just gonna cards on the table. We were evaluating for a bunch of things, and one of them was, we filled a couple of people out who were very depressed and were clearly sending a subtle signal that they needed somebody to make their life worth living. And then if that was us, then I knew that by us being that, we would then control. They would be afraid of losing their whole life purpose because they were so depressed and lonely and nothing was working. Something I'll often see in incels or other people who will follow, like Jordan Peterson, or like trying to find someone to follow, is that I noticed that they're so depressed that they are begging for someone else to make their life tolerable. And so, yeah, we're not perfectionistic about that, but we wanted to keep a threshold of the percentage of people at Fluidity Forum. If it was most people at Fluidity Forum are like that, then the group is now all going to pressure each other into, I desperately need this source of meaning, so I'm going to pressure all the rest of you. And everybody else is part of what I think of as a ménage à trois.
Interrupting for a moment here, I'm editing this footage before uploading it to the internet, and just had the humorous realization that I made a mistake here. The phrase I had in mind was folie à deux. For some reason, I said ménage à trois, which of course is a different thing. Just randomly inserted a different French phrase with a number in it, I guess. Anyway, resuming the video, but what I meant was folie à deux.
The ménage à trois is a concept in which there is no one person who is the deceiver and the others are the deceived. The cult leader is the deceiver, everyone else is innocent. No. The cult members enforce on each other. And so that is the group dynamic in which, and I grew up in this in fundamentalist tent revival Christianity, it wasn't my dad, the pastor. He was possibly the least powerful person there in some senses, because everybody was constantly pressuring everybody else. I'm going to lose my sense of meaning unless I enforce this thing. It was a group dynamic of combined social pressure from everyone not having, they weren't coming from an abundance of meaningfulness that's hanging off the branches of every tree. Just go and pluck it. There's meaningfulness everywhere you look. Instead it was the eternalism, and eternalism says, because pattern is fixed and nebulosity is denied, it's this or nothing. That's eternalism. It's this or nothing. So I have to enforce that on the rest of the group.
Group energy is powerful.
Group energy is powerful. And so for the group to allow everyone else to have various purposes, plural, and reverence for their own purposes, but other people can have irreverence for those purposes good-naturedly, then that's a way of breaking out of the cycle. And just to keep an eye on exactly how much infofragility will be present at the event. Because if someone is begging to be domineered, to be manipulated, and then to participate in that group dynamic because they're extremely depressed and their life is not working, their relationship to themselves is not working, there just can't be too high a percentage of that as a total percentage of a group.
What is the total percentage you believe would be the maximum amount of like parasitic monks?
You know, I actually don't like setting numbers on things. You know, and people are like, oh, aren't you rat adjacent? Like, if you're a rationalist, shouldn't you try to put a percentage probability number on every thing that's your Bayesian priors? And I'm like, how would you even put a number on things?
As a toast rationalist.
Oh, yeah, the toast rationalist. You have to do the handshake thing. It's fun.
Sweet dreams are made of these. Who am I to disagree?
So let's talk about another dynamic, which is decoherence. I love the Stoa. And for a long time, people said, oh, are you going to put Fluidity Forum online? And I'm like, no, the Stoa is an intellectual salon that was online for several years. And I was like, it's got it covered. I don't want to be the second Stoa. Why bother? And the Stoa had on tons of people like we would have to Fluidity Forum for video conferences. And people would be scheduled to have Q&As, and everybody's typing in the chat. I met a lot of wonderful people there. I love the Stoa. I'm like, what if we had the Stoa in person? We'll call it Fluidity Forum. But one thing I also noticed on the Stoa was everybody was always telling everybody else that everything they said was definitely right, even when it contradicted the thing of the person who was on last week. There was a very admirable and I think forgivable and understandable desire to support everybody all the time. And there was just a lack of like, what is this group? Even like, will anybody challenge anybody? And there were some times that there were challenges, and I really liked those. Like I admire the Emil Esner Fries, who is one half of the pen name Hansi Freinacht, the Metamodernism. And they had a big debate on there that I loved. I loved that debate. The debates were the most generative part of it, where we're like, okay, we're just allowing the fact that we'll allow that we notice that we didn't agree about something, instead of everybody like, oh yes, you are so wise. Oh my goodness, you are so wise. And everything you say, Phil, is always so wise. Why is it you're never wrong? It's crazy. I don't know. Oh, and Doug is just never wrong. And Misha is never wrong. Who knew that all of us are just never wrong about anything?
Who's less wrong of the never wrong?
So pretending that nothing is said is a challenge to anything else being said. Everyone enthusiastically supports everything that everyone says, no matter how incoherent and contradictory. There's just kind of a poor epistemic hygiene. And I do see the ability to reason and disagree as being crucial to the ability to not lose your perspective and get into a domineering group dynamic. That ability, that separateness, a little bit of separateness, even though we are all connected. We are all connected, but there's also a little bit of separateness, and that helps you to avoid exploitive dynamics. And that if you have no epistemic hygiene at all, and in fact are kind of aversive to it, because that's for mean people, that's for those dualists who don't believe that all is one. Right, you've got to have a little bit of a be real. Like I was talking to Bruce, because Bruce has always taught me nonviolent communication, and I'm like, I misapplied nonviolent communication, because I wouldn't say to another person, you know what, there is a conflict between us that is going to damage our friendship. And because I wouldn't do that, I was not actually following nonviolent communication, I was avoiding conflict. So the willingness to allow, okay, I trust you, we can work through this, and there is a conflict. And then to be real with each other, that's generative. And it doesn't just descend into mush. Because if you aren't anything, then you are the same as the surrounding thought soup, and the environment just kind of like swallows you, and there's no distinction between being in the group and being out of the group, and people are like, I could get this anywhere, and it dissolves.
Question here. So maybe this is what your last point is referring to, but there's one problem, which is that if everyone disagrees with everyone, that kind of thing. But the other side of it I see is like, if everyone would say, okay, well, I'm going to say this, and it might be wrong, and if we kind of leave it there, I see another like danger zone where we just kind of never actually take accountability for what we're saying, and we never actually get that. Like we allow everything to just sort of sit adjacent to everything else, and
that's the hand waving I mentioned in the intro to Fluidity Forum talk. That there is a nihilism where the nihilism says it's complicated, but then does not proceed as meta-rational or as like the complete stance does, to say it's complicated in this way. Now we're actually going to get into the weeds about why it's complicated, because if you're just like, yes, this is completely incoherent, but it's complicated, shrug. It's kind of like, don't look at it. It's the let's not anybody talk about this mode of conflict resolution, which eventually like it comes with its own problems. And that's why I'm really glad that there is like nonviolent communication, some of these other conflict resolution methods, and yours that you brought, that's going to actually make it not only easier, but like encourage people to, let's actually broach this, and we can trust each other that it's going to be okay. Vibe collapse. Okay, so somebody says,
let's not let that shit happen.
yeah, I don't want to go to Fluidity Forum, and I've heard this so many times because, Fluidity Forum is entirely for hard-nosed people who don't, they would sneer at my ecstatic dance, and they would sneer at my woo, and they would sneer at my modalities, and they would sneer at my healing, and they're just all up in their heads. That's the only kind of thing Fluidity Forum is. Because they know that, I've had people say to me the very minute I said we're going to have slide presentations, they're like, that's not for me. Someone who had been gushing with enthusiasm about the concept moments before. But as soon as slide presentations are involved, nope, that's absolutely my enemy, because it is everywhere that I go, it is inescapable, and it is dominating in the world, and if it has to be completely excluded from all my scenes. And the only scene they will create is one with vibe collapse. Whereas in the opposite, somebody's like, I would never go to Fluidity Forum. Are you kidding me? A bunch of supernatural, superstitious people, their minds are so open, it's going to fall out of their brain, it's going to fall out of their head. I would never go. Why? Because there's any of it at all. I'm so tired of having to go to my parents' church, and that is omnipresent in the world, and all this other stuff that's forced down my throat all the time. So I can only create scenes where there's just going to be none of it. And they now create scenes that have their own vibe collapse. There is no way that you can keep all the vibes alive, tending them where neither of them crowds out all the others from the soil. So it's a gardening metaphor, I think, that works really well, because these vibes must actually grow themselves, just like the plants must grow themselves. But also you must tend to that and be like, you know what? Let's not accidentally collapse into seeing the right brain or the left brain as a threat, or to say, oh, you know what? I have a special, authentic relating is the only good kind of relating. Well, normal relating doesn't count. Or I have Bayesian rationalism. Normal being a reasonable person, and normal rationality doesn't count. Only the real special kind that my group created could ever count. And that's not true. Some of those could be power tools, but why not have a garage that is full of all your tools? Or hell, a belt that's full of all the tools. Why not have all the tools? Like Batman. Correct. I love that. Okay, so if you don't mind, we are just about out of time, but I actually stayed up till 2:30 in the morning writing the last 10 minutes of this. Because there's been a lot of talk about leaving a legacy this weekend. And I wanted to respond to that because Antiquity is one of the ways of creating a legitimacy in the group. David Chapman has a lot of essays about creating stories of what supposedly happened in the past that create a fake version of history that's we've been doing this for centuries. We're just following up on a proven, tried and true thing, even though they made it up yesterday before breakfast. And the opposite of that is invented futures, in which you say, this is incredibly new and innovative, and we're going to make a lot of money on it in Silicon Valley or somewhere like that. Oh my God, this is brand new, fresh, I'm so creative. But no, it's been done a million times. So there's two forms of altering history. So I'm going to read this, if you don't mind. I'm just going to read it directly. Here we go. Cults are mostly about the sense of legitimacy going out of control in overdrive. One way of legitimizing something is by using the concept of ancientness in some slippery ways. There are multiple reasons to draw parallels with the past, and I don't find all of those reasons useful. For example, while I was narrating the audiobook of Meaningness by David Chapman, I read a passage with a footnote in which David Chapman made reference to ancient Buddhist traditions. I'm not bringing this up to talk about the passage, although it will probably be interesting to you, but to discuss its footnote. Here's the passage and the footnote. The fundamental method of meaningness, specifically, in this instance, through open receptivity and passionate involvement, 1, first finding nebulosity, 2, then finding patterning within nebulosity, 3, finding how they relate, 4, and participating from engaged apprehension. This should sound fairly familiar. It's the method used throughout this book. Footnote. This method is structurally parallel to the 4 naljors of Dzogchen Semde. The 4 naljors rather than the 4 Ting Ngedzin, because in the threefold logic of base, path, and result, this page corresponds to the path level. I believe the 4 naljors and other Buddhist non-conceptual meditation systems that work directly with form and emptiness are powerfully synergistic with the more conceptual approach I sketch here. For an introduction, see Ngakpa Chogyam's Roaring Silence, which covers only the first 2 naljors. Shock Amazement is a difficult advanced text that includes all 4 naljors and the 4 resulting Ting Nge Dzin. The explanation of the complete stance in meaningness is not meant as a presentation of Dzogchen. They're structurally parallel, but the subject matter is not the same. I hope you understood that. Now, I personally have no connection to ancient Asia. Like, I lack the background that David has to internalize that. In these footnotes, David Chapman described parallels between a 4-step method he was presenting and ancient ideas from Vajrayana Buddhism called the 4 naljors. I'm glad to have found out about these parallels. I really am. But it doesn't belong in persuasive writing. I prefer these footnotes to be extracted into an appendix. The chapter must serve to persuade, and these parallels are persuasively irrelevant to everyone but Buddhists. When writing a persuasive book, an author must be careful of the context in which they present Antiquity to prevent misleading readers by implicitly encouraging them to be unduly impressed by the trappings of ancient pomp in which it's dressed up. Here's another example. There's an excellent episode of Michael Taft's Deconstructing Yourself podcast about Buddhism. In it, his guest Ken MacLeod said that the Sanskrit word Vajra, when found in ancient Asian religious texts, might not be translated as diamond, but as thunderbolt. Then he explained what that might imply. He and the podcast host then did that verbal tick which I call PIMAN. PIMAN is an acronym that stands for Podcast Interview Mutual Appreciation Noises. A host and a guest both say, yeah, a few times. And on spiritual podcasts, the sound, which is an expression of satisfied appreciation. That's PIMAN. And then they just move on. I understand that Michael Taft and Ken MacLeod both had mutual mental experiences while meditating and were looking to the past for clues of what sorts of mental experiences founders of Buddhism had in ancient times, which might guide them to explore similar mental operations. They're not attempting to be historians. That's fine so far as it goes. But I find myself curious about more. The PIMAN style of discussion leaves ancientness under-examined and underserved. What is happening? What are they doing? Are we mining a golden age for lost truths? Not everything in a text is meaningful just because it's old. If you treat everything in ancient texts as meaningful, it's like Nicolas Cage finding a part of a treasure map that Thomas Jefferson drew on the back of the Constitution.
That really happened.
Life is not a movie. Nothing works that way. The book's footnotes should be presented not as a source of legitimacy, but as history to encourage the reader to experience the info as neat. Neat info, which has to do, I think, with the complete stance and its textures, is different from legitimizing info. If it's neat, there's enjoyment, there's open-ended curiosity. If instead ancient things are presented as final, finished, legitimizing, going back to a perfected golden age, this creates a finality like it's forever settled. This inhibits curiosity. Instead, what historical sources give us are the seeds of ideas. They're like spores floating through the air. You might say, Matt, you don't want to call it spores. Aren't spores a fungal contamination? No, it depends. I deliberately grow mushrooms, which is a fungus, and I also grow kombucha, which is a bacterial culture, like in yogurt. Imagine if I also grew penicillin, which is mold. I'd have the trifecta of contamination. Fungus, bacteria, mold. They're not contamination unless they get into each other. On an episode of the Ex Urbe Ad Astra podcast, historian and science fiction author Ada Palmer, went into depth about using the myth of a golden age to grant legitimacy. The guest on that episode was historian David Perry. He said his father was famous for saying, "The sources always say yes." This means, as a historian, don't go trying to find something in history, or you will always find it, because you'll neglect all the counter evidence. You'll only find what you were looking for. You'll not find the overall preponderance of the evidence. Ada Palmer and David Perry succeed in their role as historians to the extent that they avoid doing what David Chapman calls fixating pattern. On the one hand, we do learn lessons from history. On the other hand, there is no wistful certainty, again David Chapman's term, that there must be something of interest. Any given research project into history must reveal something of history. It's right for some research projects to uncover no pattern. Now here is a bit from the same guy who did the clown slide in my last talk, Tyler Alterman. He pointed out that in groups, ideas are often developed socially and are the outcomes of interactions more than a lone thinker in the abstract, and don't go looking for a thing in your brain or you will find it. For example, internal family systems. If you go looking for problematic parts, the mind acts like a video game that can procedurally generate levels. It will cause parts to come into existence that explain your problems. Somatic experiencing. And again, none of these are bad things. They're all really good, which I'll explain at the end. But somatic experiencing, you look for trauma in the body, the mind starts generating or regenerating uncomfortable tensions, pains, and sensations like it's generating procedurally generated levels in a video game. That's what it does, which then regenerate the impact of the trauma. Jungian psychology, the capacity for pattern matching starts to overfit to the data. The mind starts generating ways in which archetypal influences could explain your behavior. This possibly increases the chances of actually being possessed by an archetype. Typing systems like Enneagram, astrology, MBTI, etc. And again, none of these are bad things, but the point is if the entire group now says to each other socially, like, this is the thing we're all doing, right? I love this, don't you love this? And then all of a sudden they'll go looking for it, and the next thing you know, leverage consulting has actual demons among a bunch of economics and statistics rationalists. Why? Because their mind generated demonic possession because they went looking for it. The typing systems, the mind starts generating all sorts of ways that your astrological or Keegan stage or Myers-Briggs type explains your behavior. And also your mind generates behaviors that conform you to the type. It's not that these systems are bad, but almost any system will make you hallucinate. Some hallucinations are much more useful than others. So as a group, if we have multiple modalities, then we can know that any of them might actually help somebody in some context with some problem. Because Scott Alexander was wondering in many blog posts, why is it that all modes of therapy all work? Why do they all work? Which, no, I'm not kidding, they do. They do, especially among their initial devotees and researchers and promoters, and like, why do they work? The brain generates it like procedural generation of a video game. Yes?
It's almost like we should do a bracket and see which one.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Tonight.
So,
Oh, you got it.
yeah, I've only got a little bit left and only a little bit of time.
This is awesome, man.
Thank you so much. So back to finding things in history because you went looking for them. I'm halfway through Ada Palmer's academic text, reading Lucretius in the Renaissance about De Rerum Natura, a 1st century didactic poem by Lucretius, which contains some early seeds of ideas that in later centuries took the form of science, materialism, and atheism. And she is a scholar of the Renaissance and of how did the ideas of atheism or free thought emerge. And so, like, that is dear to me, not just in her science fiction, but in her historical research. So I had to pick up her academic text. I don't usually read academic texts, had to get this one. And she's studying marginalia scribbled in hundreds of copies of De Rerum Natura owned by intellectual figures famous in their time or copied by scribes who were trying to use it to learn Latin. She does not allow herself to assume the marginalia teaches us something about atheism. The statistical analysis shows that a lot of stuff scribbled in the margins by owners of historical manuscripts meant nothing. Nothing. Most old copies usually have notes scribbled saying the readers thought it was nonsense. They passed, I love that. I'm sorry, can I just take a moment there? For me to have what I consider to be my tradition come down to me, not handed down from, oh, Lucretius said this, my son, and I am your teacher, and we must transmit a lineage. Here's atheism. Yes, I truly believe. No, they were like, Lucretius, I am taking your hand and hitting you on your face and saying, stop hitting thyself. And yet thou cannot hit thyself because I am hitting you with thine own hand. I love those margins. Those are the people who a lot of them were not rude or dismissive like that. A lot of them actually had really, really good points. And they would write, they didn't like it. They didn't believe it. They didn't accept it. They thought it was garbage. And they gave it to me anyway, with a bunch of interesting, fantastic points about why it's bunk. I'm like, you debunkers handed this thing down to me, which I just get a kick out of. Okay, so they passed it down through the centuries only because they were transcribing De Rerum Natura just to learn Latin. That's amazing. So it was transmitted from Lucretius to me, not from teacher to disciple, generation to generation. It was transmitted by those who rejected it. Just because they were trying to learn Latin, I think that's beautiful. They do not assume Lucretius was onto something just because he was more ancient than them. In point of fact, Ada Palmer takes great pains to disabuse modern atheists of the flattering notion that historical figures were atheists. Quite the contrary. And yet, Machiavelli and Voltaire and very dangerous and influential people who did amazing things for good and ill, and many others who owned a copy of De Rerum Natura left marginalia, showing that it gave them ideas that made them change the world for the better. On that same episode of the Deconstructing Yourself podcast I mentioned earlier, Ken MacLeod and Michael Taft gave an anecdote about asking a spiritual seeker to name some personage that can feel inspiring. Who inspires you? And the seeker replied, Pikachu. And they were charmed and delighted, but as Buddhist teachers, they did not quite know what to do with someone being inspired by, I don't know whether the word yidam fits here, but being inspired by Pikachu. Is Pikachu yidam? I don't know. But why is Pikachu not a transmitter of big ideas?
Yes.
Vajra lightning.
Accurate.
Vajra lightning flying out of his body. As Ada Palmer points out, because she's a huge anime fan, anime is a great source of ideas. Maybe translating Sanskrit also gives Ken MacLeod the seeds of big ideas, these spores, these dandelions, these whatever the bacteria, whatever it is that's healthy in that soil. And it was just on the loose and off the leash. And it's just out there. And I consider that to be, in some sense, perhaps the closest thing I could have to a lineage which somehow is of, not from my past, but somehow from my future, that people will build on something better than me.
I love you so much, Matt.
Thank you. And so, historical figures did not know how their work would profoundly inspire science and free thought in ways they did not intend. And indeed, they would be uncomfortable if we went back in time and told them. So I guess I'm wrapping up a talk on how not to start a cult by saying we can't have perfect control, both for better and for worse. They couldn't control what you or I or our contemporaries went on to do with what they did and said. And Ada Palmer wrote a whole series of science fiction novels about ideas from the 20th and 21st century, finding fruition 3 centuries from now, and making the readers, as we read it, super uncomfortable. And asking us point blank, as she said in so many podcast interviews, is it worth it? And she thinks it is. It is worth it. That's the philosophical premise of Too Like the Lightning and her other novels. So suppose centuries from now, there's a future of societal fluidity. And suppose they dig up my ancient podcast, Fluidity audiobooks, and listen to it. I would be disappointed if their reason was that they wanted to not think for themselves and only listened to it to dig through it for clues to the wisdom of a lost age of supposedly perfect finished fluidity. Like, you can eternalize anything, no matter how good it is, and the better it is, the more likely it is to turn into a crystallized cultic pattern, and that includes, ironically, the complete stance itself. How ironic would that be? Instead, most likely they will reject it, and I am there for it. Instead of treating me like a teacher, they'll get seeds of ideas, and maybe they'll write in the margins that it's dumb, and they'll be inspired to build something on it, something that would probably make me uncomfortable. Well, that's how it's always worked. I should be so lucky. Ideas that percolated through Sanskrit and the Norse Eddas and Lucretius and everyone else, down to you and me. Ada Palmer and David Perry, Michael Taft and Ken MacLeod mutating at every step. The seeds of ideas is the closest thing to a lineage that I imagine leaving for the future. So, in a way, those in the future who correct and build on my mistakes are my lineage instead of those in the past. This talk is under a Creative Commons Attribution, not for profit, international 4.0 license. I'm Matt Arnold. Until next time, thanks for listening.